We just make sure there's no one waiting in the waiting room. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this second webinar on applying for academic jobs, navigating the academic job market. And thank you to anyone who is watching this after the fact. So this evening will proceed in a relatively similar fashion to our previous webinar. For those of you that may not have been at that or did not watch that, I have some prepared remarks that I will go through. They'll take me somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes or so, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, I'm not really sure. And then I will happily take questions at the end. As I speak, if you think of questions that you would like to ask, you are welcome to go ahead and pop those into the chat. But I will just wait until I get all the way through everything that I'm going to say before I address those. So I'm not ignoring you. I'm just saving them all till the end. But if you think of things, please just feel free to pop them in the chat if you don't want to worry about trying to remember them all the way to the end. In this webinar, we're going to focus on some documents that I referenced briefly in the last webinar. But you are welcome to ask questions about anything. If you, for example, were not able to attend last time and had a question that you didn't ever get answered, or if you have thought of something else you wanted to ask about in the interim, that's perfectly fine as well. So your questions do not have to be specifically and solely related to these documents. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And you will see that I'm actually in the MFA Students Canvas course. That's because instead of a presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some actual sample documents. But really quickly, before I get to that, let me just show you all. So if you go to the modules page, I have created an entire module about materials for the academic job market. So this very first one is a link to the first webinar. Sometime tomorrow, I will get a link to this one up there as well. Here, the second link, excuse me, is the slides that I shared during the last webinar. And then the only other things I wanted to quickly reference is one thing that I thought might be useful, but I didn't want to sort of clog up one of these live events with, was breaking down an academic job advertisement. So what I've done is I created a video that, again, you click there and you can find it, that is of me basically using screenshot software, reading through and kind of annotating an academic job advertisement. Just things that might be potentially confusing, or just sort of whatever insider information I can glean and gin up about looking at that. And then I've also got a page here that I'm not actually going to go through word by word, that just gives you some extra information about a number of documents, statements, and kinds of things that you may be asked to put together, kind of like a written version of some of the highlights of what I'm going to talk about tonight, so that you can review that as you might wish to. So what I'm going to focus on this evening is what I consider to be 3 specific documents that are probably the most important that you will encounter in job ad requests. And those are the cover letter, the curriculum vitae, and the teaching philosophy statement. We talked briefly about a cover letter and a CV in the last webinar, but tonight I'm going to actually look at some samples. And then I'll go through a teaching philosophy statement, and then I'll speak just very briefly about some other things as it relates to other kinds of documents that you might be asked to include that often have to do with teaching materials. And I'll speak to those a little bit at the end. So just a couple things before I open up the sample cover letter and start talking about these. One, I'm not going to read them all word for word. That's why I've made them available to you, so that if you want to have access and read them word for word, you can. I'm going to more broadly take a kind of general do's and don'ts, why this is important, how you might think about structuring these kinds of things. Should you engage other resources that are out there about these academic job search materials, you will probably find people who have other or different advice than I do. There's lots of different ways to do these things. For example, if you Google how to structure a CV, you're going to find dozens, maybe hundreds of different ways that that document might actually look, right? So this is not to say that what I have to say is necessarily universally perfect. I don't think that's the case at all. But I will tell you, these are the CV, the cover letter, even the sample syllabus, and this teaching philosophy statement are all documents that they're real. These are documents I used when I went on the academic job market a number of years ago, for the first time, since being in my previous job. For those of you that don't know this about me, I taught at a community college actually very close to Lindenwood for 10 years full time before moving over to Lindenwood. These aren't the precise documents that I used to apply for this job, but they are documents that I used in searching for other jobs, with some good amount of success over a couple of years. And then the only other thing that I'll say about these before I open them up, and I hope that this doesn't sound big-headed or like I'm patting myself on the back, because that's not my intention by saying this. What you're going to see are materials for someone who has been fortunate enough to spend at the time of writing them, nearly 15 years in sort of an academic and writerly life. So I've been very lucky to have published a lot, to have taught a lot, and to have worked at academic institutions that have allowed me to do things that I can speak to, to a great degree in these application materials. And I will just say, before you worry about it, no, you would not need to have this kind of profile in order to feel like a viable candidate for what I will call, just for lack of another word, an entry-level teaching position. So your typical tenure track assistant professor of English. I would not apply for those kinds of positions at this point in my career, just by virtue of how much time I've spent and the luck that I've had in getting to do the things that one has to do. So don't necessarily, I don't mean these documents to be examples of what your content needs to look like in terms of amount, but just in terms of structure and style, I think. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start. And again, please feel free as I am going through this, if you think of questions you want to ask, you can pop those in the chat. So I'm going to start by opening the sample cover letter, and we'll talk about this a little bit. So I would say that the cover letter that you write, this is perhaps more than anything else, the most important document in applying for an academic job. If other people who serve on search committees are anything like I was when I have served on these, this is usually the first document that somebody reviewing applications is going to look at. And so if you can only devote a certain amount of time to any given document, this is the one to give the most of your time. So the first thing is you want this to be on letterhead. You may have noticed in the module, I have uploaded Lindenwood's letterhead to the MFA students Canvas course, so that you can download that and you can pop your cover letter right in there. That's just kind of what folks expect. And then off we go. So notice this is single spaced, Times New Roman, 12-point font. It may actually be 11. Sometimes I fudge the size a little bit in the past, but your goal is for everything to fit on approximately 2 single-spaced pages at most. Some position listings will say that your letter can be up to 3 pages, but more often you're going to see 1 to 2 single-spaced pages. Sorry, so you want to keep it somewhere in there. Obviously, just like any other letter, you start with the date. And then I like to, I think I mentioned this briefly in the last webinar, but that's okay. Dear members of the search committee is a great way to use for your salutation. Some searches will indicate who the chair of the search is, and so you can certainly address it to that person if you can find that information. But I find that dear members of the search committee is perfectly fine. Okay, so like I said, I'm not going to read every single word of this, but I'm going to kind of highlight what happens throughout the letter in kind of each paragraph. There are some ways that you can kind of shift around paragraphs if you like. Certainly some things are not compulsory to be in a particular sequence, but your opening paragraph wants to do a couple of things for sure. First, you want to specify what position and the university. So I wrote this to the University of Kentucky. I am writing to apply for the position of professor of creative writing at the University of Kentucky. So you can bespoke that. That should be very specific. In general terms, just to back up really quickly, most of the time you don't need to make cover letters super particular. There are a couple of places, and most of them are in this opening paragraph, and then you'll see one thing near the end of the letter that you can make very particular. But a lot of the time, my letters didn't change at all between institutions, except for that first line and some lines near the very end. Okay, so we've got our opening sentence, then just what your credentials are. So I will read this little part. I possess a PhD in English with an emphasis in fiction writing from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and I'm currently a tenured associate professor of English at St. Charles Community College in Cottleville, Missouri. So if you don't already have a job, just indicate that you possess an MFA in writing from Lindenwood University. One general rule of thumb for writing this cover letter, perhaps the most important thing, is don't draw attention to things you lack, even if they're things that a job ad indicates they would like. So rather than saying something like, I'm not currently in an academic job, or as might be the case for many of you, you may not have teaching experience, don't say, I have not taught before, but instead couch everything in terms of what you're excited to do. So even if you haven't taught, you can say things like, I've been trained, my training has prepared me and made me excited to teach courses in ekphrastic poetry or fantasy writing, etc., right? The place that you can do some things at the end of this paragraph, and what you can do with the rest of the paragraph, is to talk about some of those bespoke things. So if I'm remembering correctly, this job at the University of Kentucky that I obviously didn't end up getting was interested in people who could teach a variety of courses with sort of diverse worldwide perspectives. So that's why I've added this worldwide perspectives and have identified writers that I would use. So that's kind of where you might bespoke or individualize to things that a job ad indicates that a potential employer is interested in. Just to draw, and again, it doesn't have to be things that you have done. It could be things that you are excited to do, as opposed to experience that you actually have. So for writing jobs, like the teaching creative writing jobs, your next big paragraph is really going to be you talking about yourself as a writer. Ideally, if you've got some publications under your belt, this is where you might bring some of those up. But most importantly is going to be kind of talking about who you are as a writer and the writers with whom you are in conversation. So when you think about those of you that either are taking or have taken your thesis course, part of the reason we ask you to write the front matter that talks about your craft and the writers that you are inspired by or in conversation with is that's kind of preparing you to write this kind of paragraph. Okay. And then, just sort of a brief snippet of things that you've accomplished as a writer, if you have them. Again, if you haven't published anything, don't say, I haven't published anything, but I really hope that happens soon. And also, this can be a little tricky. You're not trying to be a salesperson who says that certain people will enjoy their work. You just say, I write this kind of writing. I'm in conversation with these folks. Here's what I'm trying to accomplish in my work. And here's where, if anywhere, it has appeared. Okay. So that you do want to be paragraph 2. Now, the rest, except for the last paragraph, is where things can kind of go in different orders, and what you do is going to be informed by what you've done. Okay, so again, this is the part where I'm going to kind of skip through mine because, again, and I don't want to sound, I'm not trying to sound boastful here. I've been very lucky to have spent over 10 years teaching and working in creative writing as a teacher. And so I have been able to work in a lot of different capacities as a department chair, a coordinator of programming, et cetera, et cetera. What I think you would want to do here, if you haven't done that, if you haven't taught, is you would want to talk about how you will be as a teacher. So I talk about being in tune with the contemporary writing landscape, having interest in teaching courses of writers who are writing now. Who are the people who would show up on a syllabus if you were to teach? What kinds of things are you interested in doing in a teaching job besides just teaching? Because the reality is most faculty in full-time positions, there's an expectation that they're going to participate in their institution in more ways than just teaching. So you might just think of it this way. Think of the things that either either at our MFA or when you were an undergraduate, whether you were a student of English or not, there was stuff going on campus. And more often than not, somehow, sometimes your faculty were involved in those things. So think about what the kind of things are that you would like, that you're impassioned about, that you could bring in that kind of service. And then so you want to do that, and then you also want to give a little glimpse about what it is you want to do with potential students. So I have a paragraph here. Sorry, all about how I do workshops, what it is I want my students to do and to experience and to understand. This is going to be reflective a little bit of that teaching philosophy statement that we'll come to here shortly. But the reason that you talk about this is, one, a job posting just may not have asked you to submit a teaching philosophy statement, or two, they will want to get a little bit of a blip about who you are as a teacher before they even get to that teaching philosophy statement. Okay, so that paragraph certainly belongs somewhere. So that's the general structure. So your kind of introduction to yourself as a writer, and then in some order, the kinds of service that you have or would like to do, your sense of who important writers are that readers should be reading, and how you might go about teaching, especially how you would go about teaching creative writing courses. And then at the very end, you kind of wrap things up in this sort of very ho-hum, boring sort of way. So something like, based on my experience, I believe I can be an excellent asset to the specific school you're applying to. Make sure that you change that. I have certainly forgotten about that myself, and that's embarrassing. And then I say, thank you for considering my application. And then whatever other documents they've asked for, I just like to list there, because then it really lets them know that I know what they've asked for. And then something like, if you require any additional materials, please do not hesitate to contact me via phone or email at your convenience. And then sincerely, blah, blah, blah. So just one thing I'll note is this if is kind of important. So if you require additional materials, please don't hesitate to contact me. Don't say something like, I look forward to hearing from you. I can't wait to talk more, because you have no guarantee that's going to happen. Right. And there's it can be this fine line between confidence and presumption. So I have found that just, if you need anything else, give me a phone call or an email. That does the job. And some places will email you, and some folks will give you a call if they want more, or if they want to set up the interview. So those are the basics of the cover letter. And again, it's okay if you don't have all these things, in which case you talk about what you would do. You know, and you can even write this as if you have done the teaching. So in teaching creative writing courses, here's my goal. Here's what I want to accomplish. Here's how I run workshops. Even if you're really speaking hypothetically, they'll figure it out. And if they care, they'll care. If they don't, they won't. Okay. So that's what I have to say about the cover letter. So let's now turn to the CV. I have to make you all tiny real quick. Now, one thing I'm just going to point out real quick. I just noticed this earlier today when I was taking a look at this. This is not what my CV looks like. So you may want to download this one, which I'm going to do, and hope that you can all still see it. Probably not. So it looks different when it's downloaded. So the font did something funny. So if it like this looks all weird, it should not. Now, again, this is a document where if you go looking around on the internet, you're going to find dozens and dozens of different ways that people tell you to format this thing. There's not one right or wrong way, but I do think there are some very particular strategic things that you want to do in terms of how you sequence a document like this. Different organizations and institutions and different search committees within them are going to do different things with these. So sometimes it's just to check that you meet minimum qualifications. Some committees will take a much closer look at this document. So you never know. But having it contain the important stuff is what you want to think about. Slightly less important is how things are sequenced, but there are some suggestions. And again, if you don't have something, don't include a heading for that section and just write not applicable. Just leave it off. Just leave it out if you don't have it. So some kind of so I'll just say, your name goes somewhere near the top, then your address could be your work address and or your home address. Just make sure that, I don't know why I took my home address out of here just to be safe. You never know who's watching. but your email address and your phone number want to be on here so that they can contact you. These days, obviously, with most applications being online in some capacity, um, those things will be, stored for a committee elsewhere, but it's always good to have on there. So I like to start with education, going in order from most terminal / most recent degree to the oldest, where you got it, when you got it, et cetera, et cetera. And then publications usually come next for creative writers, big to small. So if you have any books, start with those and then move towards particular genres. Because I primarily teach fiction and would mostly be applying for fiction jobs, my fiction publications come first. I have selected listed here. I don't put everything on there. Um, and I don't want to sound big-headed. I have more than I need to put on there. So I simply put selected, and it's kind of the most recent set. Again, this looks weird because of and in terms of what you should list, you can just put the title, where it was published, and the when. That's plenty. That's all they need. Then I have creative nonfiction because I have it, and a couple of poems that I've got. And that is probably the most important stuff. If you have any writing related awards, or publication related awards, teaching awards, any awards that are kind of quote unquote in or industry adjacent, you can certainly include those. And then any teaching that you've had, teaching experience that you might have had. So again, starting most recent to least recent. One thing that's worth mentioning that you probably have already noticed, I guess general wisdom for the non-academic world is that your resume should be no more than 1 page. And this might even be worth mentioning for talking about cover letters. When applying for like corporate jobs, usually cover letters are 1 page, resumes are about 1 page. These can be much longer. Okay, so you'll see mine is 6 pages. So that's not a problem. So if you have teaching experience, you would list the institution, what your title was, when you taught, and then just list your courses. So when I was at the community college, I taught a whole bunch of different stuff over the course of 10 years. And you can even break down, like I taught the same class under different topics, and you can sort of identify what those were. If you have any editorships or assistantships, so if you worked, for example, on the Mid-Rivers no, sorry, wrong school, wrong journal. If you worked on the Lindenwood Review, you could put editorship, reader / assistant editor, whatever title it is that I know Beth Mead runs that. I don't know what she has you all call yourselves, but you can call yourself an editorial assistant. Put that on there, those kinds of things. And then if you've done any academic style service, so if you have worked at a university or a college, you can include that kind of stuff. And then the last thing that you would include is your references, folks that can serve as recommenders or offer you up a letter of recommendation or a phone reference if and as needed, and you just give their contact information and their name. That usually always comes last. Again, some of this stuff in the middle here in terms of editorships, service, blah, blah, blah. Some folks suggest, I know that one of the sensibilities that I was actually told when I was in graduate school and started applying for jobs is if the institution seems more teaching focused, to start with teaching and then move to publications. And if it was more like an R1 school where you have a low teaching load, start with your publishing and then switch to your teaching. So there might be some purchase to that, but in my experience, I don't know that really matters. It's just having the information in a relatively easy to read and sortable way that's important. So again, structure is less important here than what's actually included and what is not. So again, notice, I worked for years at a couple of restaurants when I was younger. I don't have any of that in here. I don't have just volunteer work that I've done. Now, if you've worked with, if you've done readings or worked with like writing groups, that's great experience to include, especially if you have not taught before or you don't have a lot of other publications, haven't ever won a grant. Again, that's okay. Those are the kinds of things that you might include. What you will probably find, and again, not trying to sound big-headed or prideful here when I say this, what you want to include is going to shift over time as you start getting more things published, as you start teaching in either a full or part-time capacity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so again, those are the basics of the curriculum vitae. Okay. I'm going to skip the sample syllabus and go to the sample teaching philosophy, because I want to make sure we get some time to talk about this, because it is, again, one of the other important things. So probably after the CV and the cover letter, which I mentioned this maybe at the beginning of this talk, I have literally never encountered an academic job ad that did not ask for a cover letter and a CV. The next most popular documents for creative writing jobs are, one, a sample of creative work. I didn't feel that it was particularly necessary to share with you an example sample of creative work, because that should just be whatever you think is your best creative work, within the bounds of how many pages they want. So every job ad is going to tell you, if they want a sample of creative work, how much to send. Okay. The next one after that is a teaching philosophy statement. Um, these can be really varied in terms of how long they should be. I have seen calls for a 250-word teaching philosophy statement, which is like practically one double-space page, all the way up to 1,000 words, which is several single-space pages. So it's really going to depend on the institution. One thing that may be worth it is to have a couple different versions that have that are of different lengths. So when I was doing my real searches for jobs, I would have a couple of different versions of this. And also, the other thing that it might be worth to have a couple of different versions for has to do with whether you are applying for a job that is primarily teaching creative writing, or if you're applying for a job that is going to ask you to teach a whole variety of things. Again, that would come up in the job advertisement. And so so you might want to have a version that is more narrowly, as you're going to see with this example, focused on your philosophies about teaching creative writing. And you may want to have a version that sort of widens the lens a little bit to talk about teaching a variety of different things, either just teaching in general, or teaching both creative writing, literature, and or the dreaded first year composition that so many creative writers have to teach these days. So anyway, those are just a few things. So this sample is a sample that is designed for jobs teaching primarily or exclusively creative writing. You'll see it's a little over a page long. I want to say it's about 400 to 500 words. 500 words is probably the sweet spot. So my default would be write a 500-word version. If you need to add some more material, you can. If you need to shrink it down, you can take some stuff out and save those different versions. The way that I like to think of this document is you are trying to weave in and out of broad philosophical ideas about teaching and specific activities, and again, writers that you might have students engage with. You do want to do a little bit of name dropping here. So I think, again, and this is probably the document that has the most variety of what people suggest one does. So I like to think that a great teaching philosophy starts with one sentence that, if one needed it, could be the only sentence in the whole document. And so mine personally is, my pedagogy is founded by the belief that the best writers are the best readers. Okay, so if you read well, you will inevitably write well. Okay, so I talk about that. So that's my very specific sort of thesis. And then I kind of widen that out a little bit to talk about examining reading and writing habits and reading practices, and how that takes shape within my various courses. Okay. Again, I do name drop. I mentioned Jennifer Egan, Britt Bennett, Susanna Clark, Melissa Phoebos, all sorts of folks here, trying to demonstrate, sort of kind of unspoken, is that I'm well read and read a variety. And so not just naming one kind of writer, or one demographic of writer, or one style of writer, is the way to go. So I start there, and then I kind of move through some other big philosophical ideas. So I further believe that the best classroom environment is one in which students are invited to interrogate two things: themselves and the world they inhabit. And again, sort of talking about how one does that. And so you might think of this as a way to identify, like, the biggest principles that you do or would have as a teacher. And again, no need to admit, quote unquote, admit whether you have taught or not. They're far less curious in this document about your experience. That's what the CV is for. Than they are, what is it that you will have or would do in the classroom? How can they come to understand who you are as a teacher as much as possible by virtue of this document? Okay. And so finding those moments where you can talk big, broad, theoretical, you know, oh, I want students to interrogate themselves in the world that they inhabit. Okay, well, how do I do that? So then I talk about some of those sorts of things. I say philosophically, it's important to me that my students see me as a fellow writer. So specific practices. When I ask everyone in class to read a response to an exercise aloud, I share my work as well. I often refer to my own writing, particularly that which I'm working on at the time when relevant to a subject. If you have taught and you have examples, that's great. You should also feel empowered to steal ideas from your instructors. So if there is something that an MFA instructor did that you thought was a really great way to run a class or a really great activity or assignment prompt, and you want to claim that you use it or would use it in class, go ahead and do that. Nothing wrong with that. Um, because you're trying to give the sense that these are the kinds of things you would and do. And then kind of like writing an essay, you sort of end just like with the cover letter with just sort of a wrap up of like what it is that you try to do and try to be most broadly as a teacher, right? What it is that you want. And I do think that ending with a little bit of like optimism and a sense that you actually enjoy the idea of being a teacher is a good thing. And this doesn't have to be heavy-handed, but it can just be something like, I've walked away from the classes that I've taught with a sense of enjoyment and satisfaction, looking forward to the opportunity to continue exploring writing literature with every one of my future students. Perhaps borders a little bit on schmaltzy, but I think it gets the job done because you're trying to give away little bits of your personality and your attitudes about teaching, along with, what it is that you do as a teacher. Okay. So that's kind of how I would suggest going about this. So wending together, again, think of it, you might, as you're starting to draft a document like this, you might think of like, what are maybe 4 philosophical conceptions that are important to you as a teacher? And then what are the specifics that you give a couple of details of what you mean by that, think about how you do it, and maybe periodically who are the writers that you use to accomplish it. So if that helps as sort of a practical guide to writing a document like that. Okay. So those are those 3 documents. So now I actually am, now that I think about it further, I am going to hop into this overview of application documents page just briefly to explain this little section. So the teaching, what I call teaching portfolio materials. So sometimes you'll get asked by institutions to provide a teaching portfolio. So some places will use that term, and then sometimes they will explicitly say what they want those to contain. More often than not, that's going to include your teaching philosophy statement, which just to reiterate, I've kind of captured a lot of this right here, the stuff I just spoke to. But so a teaching portfolio will often include the teaching philosophy statement, and then a syllabus or 2 from classes you either have taught or courses you would teach, maybe instructions for an assignment that you would require in a course, if applicable, artifacts from that students produced in classes that you've taught, or course evaluations. Often you see those less often because, again, they might anticipate having some applicants that don't have that teaching experience. But when you are putting together a teaching portfolio, if you're going to be asked to do something like that, or sometimes it will just be evidence of teaching effectiveness. And if you come across evidence of teaching effectiveness, that would kind of be these kinds of things, and you kind of get to decide. But essentially, what they're trying to see is what sorts of things you have done or would do concretely as a teacher. And so you'll just want to think about what you want those things to be. And it is understood sometimes that some of those materials are hypothetical. So a couple of years ago, I applied for a position that involved teaching undergraduates and graduate students. And of course, and the job did not require experience teaching graduate students. And so one of the things they asked for was a pair of sample syllabi, one from an undergraduate course, one from a graduate level course, that I was asked to send as part of a supplement to my application. So I made it through their first round of review. So it didn't bother them that I had not taught at the graduate level because my CV and my materials made it very clear that I had only taught at a community college. Obviously, no graduate level courses there. So it was understood when I created the syllabi that I sent them that at the very least, the graduate level syllabus was completely invented, that I had completely made that up. And just like with other documents, there's no necessarily right way to make those look. You can certainly use our syllabi for our class as an example. Our courses as like a template. But I would suggest removing a bunch of the institutional stuff. So that's why I shared this other syllabus. This was a real syllabus from a course that I taught a couple of years ago at St. Charles Community College that was much more stripped down and just sort of the basics of my course. In terms of like, here's my contact information, my course description, the materials that I asked students to do, the things that are the assignments, their descriptions, and then a schedule of activities. What else did I have in here? Oh, and I also included, because I actually did include this when I was teaching the class, some information about workshopping, et cetera, and a couple of other documents that I included. But again, these can really look like whatever you want. And so part of the reason that I've included this here is just so you can see what other syllabi might look like for undergraduate level courses or just for other courses that you might create a syllabus for. And again, it is understood that sometimes you might be inventing or identifying kind of a dream class. That is just as an offshoot, that is a not uncommon interview question. If you could teach any class that you ever, given no restraints and no restrictions on content or level of course, if you could do whatever you want, what's a dream class you'd want to teach? So that's worth both thinking about as something you might potentially answer, but also is certainly worth perhaps trying to reflect a little in a sample syllabus. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and stop sharing because that is what I have to share and what I have prepared. Let me go into the chat. Okay. So let's see. So if you have questions, feel free to start typing them into the chat. Beth, yes, that would count for sure. Yes. University or whatever level of school it is, having an in-house publication is absolutely fine. Yes, definitely include that as a thing that goes on your line of publications. That was the first thing that I ever had published was at when I was a student at Truman State. I had, I think, like 2 little short stories published in our literary magazine, and those are the first things that were ever on my CV for writing publications. So absolutely. What else? Are there other questions that I can answer? I feel like I both belabored the point sometimes, but also sped through that very quickly. And again, questions don't have to be specific to application materials that I just went through, but could also be anything that you can think of as it relates to applying for academic jobs. Yes, Jared. So if you here, I'll show you. Yes, you popped in right after I had done that, so I'm happy to show again. So if you go to the MFA Students Canvas course, and then just click modules, all of the documents are in the second module. So there's the department head announcements and messages, and then academic job market materials. It's these 3, and the sample syllabus is right here. So yeah, so you can find all of that right there. You all are more than welcome to download them at any time and read through them as closely as you might like. Feel free to steal as much language there as you might want to. I mean, don't pretend that you did my stuff, but you can otherwise use the language pretty generally. Luis, good question. I don't know that I would say there's a whole lot you need to address differently between online and traditional programs. One thing that I think if you are going to apply for a job teaching in an online program, one, it's very much worth mentioning that the program you were in as a student was heavily online because you've got the experience of kind of understanding what the student experiences is like in that regard. This does not mean that you would be looked down upon in the more traditionally oriented programs. That's where some of the stuff in that very first paragraph of the cover letter that I was referencing, if you're applying for a job in a more traditional program, you would just kind of talk about the classes you want to teach. If you're applying for one in an online, that's a sort of online program, I think highlighting that you took your coursework in online experiences and are as a result well experienced with what students in online programs are looking for and will experience, what works, what doesn't. That's a great place to reference that. Yes, Jared. Yeah. So the first item, the first link in that module is the link to the YouTube recording of the last webinar, and tomorrow I'll get this one uploaded in the same way. They should be everlasting now because Teams recordings do expire, but I saved the recording to my computer and made it into a YouTube video, so they should be available. I hope that answered your question, Luis. Before I distracted myself with the next question. But yeah, but in terms of um needing to, oh great, yeah. But so that's where I would talk about that a little bit. Would be in that opening paragraph. I wouldn't, just by the way, the one thing that makes me think of is and I may have talked about this a little bit last time. One thing that I would, speaking of do's and don'ts, another don't that I would, a don't that I would not do is you don't really need to make reference to things that you might imagine just about everybody that's in the writing world or applying for jobs has done. We don't need to be telling people that we're good at Microsoft Word and that we know how to send emails, right? Like it's 2025. Hopefully we know how to do that. Similarly, it is worth referencing that you were in an online program if you're applying to teach for an online program, but I wouldn't necessarily otherwise say anything about, oh, I've used Canvas as an LMS, because everybody's used an LMS, learning management system, these days. Like it's kind of default assumed that people have encountered learning management systems, right? But having been a student in an entire program that has been pretty much all online is definitely worth that. Hopefully that distinction makes sense to everybody. Because sometimes when I used to read applications at my last job, people would be spending a whole bunch of time talking about things that just one kind of expects that everybody applying for an academic job in the 21st century has done and is quote unquote an expert in. So, any other questions that anyone can think of? I'll give people a second if they want to type anything in or ask out loud. Just making sure I don't cut anybody off who might be typing quickly or slowly. Well, in that case, I'm going to talk very slow. So if anybody thinks of anything as I'm saying goodbye, I will pause. I will stop saying goodbye and answer your question. So thank you all for coming. Like I said, I will have this recording posted tomorrow once I navigate getting it uploaded to YouTube and all of that. If following this you think of questions, if you're anything like me, when I go to something informative like that, like an hour later, a question will occur to me. You are welcome to reach out to me with those questions. If you start looking for and have interest, if you have interest in and start looking for academic jobs and you ever run across anything weird or confusing or strange in an advertisement that you would like some help decoding, drop me a line, send me a link to the advertisement, and I'll be happy to share my thoughts. So that's it. So thank you all again for being here, and I hope you have a great evening. And for those of you that are continuing in the program this fall, look forward to seeing you in about a month when classes get back underway and we continue with our exciting programming. So take care, everyone. If it's anything like outside where you are, like it is here, please stay cool and safe, and we'll see you soon. All right, thanks, everybody.